Welcome, dear listeners, to History with Herodotus, where we embark on a journey through the annals of time, unraveling the mysteries of the past and illuminating the present. Today, we find ourselves at the threshold of one of the most pivotal events in modern history, the Russian Revolution. This seismic upheaval, which shook the foundations of an empire and reshaped the course of human destiny, is a tale of intrigue, passion, and transformation. As we delve into the origins of this revolution, let us transport ourselves to the Russia of the early 19th century, a land of vast expanses, from the snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus to the rolling steppes of Ukraine. It was an era marked by the autocratic rule of the Romanov dynasty, with Tsar Nicholas I at its helm. The year was 1825, and the Decembrist revolt, led by a group of liberal aristocrats, had just been crushed on the Senate Square in St. Petersburg. This event, though ultimately unsuccessful, marked the beginning of a long and winding road that would lead Russia's revolutionaries through the trials of exile, imprisonment, and martyrdom. As we explore the historical context of this period, we find ourselves in the midst of a society grappling with the contradictions of modernization and tradition. The Russian Empire, with its sprawling territories and diverse population, was struggling to maintain its grip on power in the face of growing discontent among its subjects. The nobility, who had long been the backbone of the Russian state, were increasingly divided between those who advocated for reform and those who clung to the old order. In this tumultuous landscape, a new generation of thinkers and activists emerged, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Men like Alexander Herzen, Mikhail Bakunin, and Sergei Nikolaev would soon become prominent figures in the revolutionary movement, advocating for radical change and social justice. The year 1848, with its wave of revolutions sweeping across Europe, had a profound impact on the Russian revolutionary movement, as intellectuals and activists began to draw inspiration from the likes of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. As we pause to consider the complex interplay of factors that contributed to the Russian Revolution, we must also examine the role of the Russian people themselves. The peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, were burdened by poverty, serfdom, and lack of representation. The workers, who toiled in the factories and mills of St. Petersburg and Moscow, were exploited and mistreated by their capitalist masters. And the intelligentsia, who had been educated in the ideas of Western Europe, were increasingly disillusioned with the autocratic regime that ruled their country. The revolutionary movement, though still in its infancy, was beginning to take shape. Secret societies and underground organizations sprouted up, dedicated to spreading radical ideas and fomenting dissent. The likes of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who wrote the influential novel What Is to Be Done, and Pyotr Tolstoy, who advocated for a revolutionary vanguard, would soon emerge as leading voices in the movement. As we conclude this first segment on the origins of the Russian Revolution, we invite you to join us on a journey into the heart of this maelstrom, where the fate of empires and ideologies hung in the balance. The year 1917 beckons, with its promise of transformation and upheaval. Let us proceed, with wonder and curiosity, into the very epicenter of this revolutionary storm. Welcome back to History with Herodotus, as we continue our journey through the annals of time, unraveling the mysteries of the Russian Revolution. The year 1917 was a watershed moment in Russian history, marked by the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the establishment of a provisional government. But it was also a time of great uncertainty and chaos, as various factions and interest groups vied for power. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, were one such group, and their influence would soon become decisive. As we delve into this period, let us transport ourselves to the streets of Petrograd, where the sounds of gunfire and protests filled the air. The February Revolution, which had begun as a series of spontaneous demonstrations, had quickly gained momentum, with workers, soldiers, and sailors joining forces to demand an end to the war and better living conditions. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, struggled to maintain order, but it was clear that the old regime was crumbling. The Bolsheviks, who had been secretly gathering support among the working class and the military, saw their chance to strike. Lenin, who had returned from exile in April 1917, began to rally his followers with a series of impassioned speeches and writings. His call for peace, bread, and land resonated deeply with the Russian people, who were tired of war and hungry for change. The summer of 1917 was a time of intense activity, as the Bolsheviks built their strength and prepared for a seizure of power. The party's newspaper, Pravda, became a powerful tool for propaganda, spreading Lenin's message to a wider audience. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks' military organization, led by Leon Trotsky, began to secretly arm and train workers and soldiers, preparing them for the coming struggle. The October Revolution, which took place on November 7, 1917, was a decisive moment in Russian history. The Bolsheviks, backed by their armed supporters, stormed key government buildings and seized control of Petrograd. The provisional government was toppled, and Lenin declared the establishment of the world's first socialist state. As we explore this period, we find ourselves in the midst of a maelstrom of activity, with events unfolding at a dizzying pace. The Bolsheviks' seizure of power was followed by a series of decrees aimed at transforming Russian society and economy. The nationalization of industry, the redistribution of land, and the establishment of a new system of government were just a few of the radical measures introduced by the Bolsheviks. The period that followed was marked by both triumph and tragedy. The Bolsheviks' efforts to build a socialist state were hindered by civil war, foreign intervention, and economic chaos. But despite these challenges, the revolution had unleashed a wave of creativity and innovation, as artists, writers, and thinkers began to explore new possibilities. As we pause to consider the significance of this period, we must also examine the role of key figures, such as Lenin, Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin. Their contributions, both positive and negative, would shape the course of Russian history for decades to come. The years that followed the Bolshevik seizure of power were marked by both achievement and atrocity, as the Soviet Union struggled to build a new society and assert its place on the world stage. Let us proceed with wonder and curiosity into the final chapter of this revolutionary saga. Welcome back to History with Herodotus, as we conclude our journey through the annals of time, unraveling the mysteries of the Russian Revolution. The years that followed the Bolshevik seizure of power were marked by both achievement and atrocity, as the Soviet Union struggled to build a new society and assert its place on the world stage. The Civil War, which lasted from 1918 to 1922, was a brutal and devastating conflict that pitted the Bolsheviks against their enemies, including the Tsarist loyalists, the Mensheviks, and the socialist revolutionaries. The war saw widespread destruction, famine, and loss of life, with estimates suggesting that up to 1 million people died. Despite these challenges, the Soviet Union made significant progress in the 1920s and 1930s under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and later Joseph Stalin. The new economic policy, introduced by Lenin in 1921, allowed for a degree of economic liberalization and helped to stimulate growth and recovery. The Soviet Union also became a major industrial power, with significant advances in fields such as steel production, coal mining, and manufacturing. However, the Soviet Union's progress was also marked by darkness and repression. Stalin's rule, which began in 1922, was characterized by brutal suppression of opposition, forced labor camps, and widespread famine. The most notable example is the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33, known as the Holodomor, which killed an estimated 3.5 million people. Stalin's regime also saw the rise of a cult of personality, with the Soviet leader becoming increasingly isolated and paranoid. The legacy of the Russian Revolution is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, it inspired a generation of socialists and communists around the world, who saw in it a beacon of hope for a more equal and just society. The revolution also led to significant advances in fields such as education, healthcare, and women's rights. However, the Soviet Union's authoritarianism, repression, and violence also served as a warning about the dangers of totalitarianism. As we reflect on the Russian Revolution, we are reminded that history is full of contradictions and paradoxes. The revolution's ideals of equality, justice, and freedom were noble and inspiring, but its implementation was often brutal and repressive. As the Russian writer and dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, "The Soviet Union was a system that destroyed the very things it claimed to be fighting for." As we conclude our journey through the annals of time, we are left with more questions than answers. What can we learn from the Russian Revolution's successes and failures? How can we balance the need for social justice and equality with the importance of individual freedom and human rights? And what does the revolution's legacy mean for us today, as we navigate our own complex and often contradictory world? We hope that our journey has inspired you to think critically about history, to question assumptions, and to seek out new perspectives. Join us next time on History with Herodotus, as we explore another fascinating chapter in the story of human civilization. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that to understand the present, we must first understand the past.